Hi guys, Michael here, and I just want to bring to you another quick tutorial. And this one might not be so quick because there's a lot of explaining to do. I'm just going to be explaining the best settings to get cinematic video. So if you're shooting something for film or a movie, or you want something to be really cinematic, these are the best settings you should use. Now just remember before I get started that not all of these settings are set in concrete. There's some things you'll have to change depending on where you are, your environment, and some things that just aren't possible sometimes. So first thing we're going to start with is the frame rate of your camera. So most countries have a cinematic standard. So in Australia here, our cinematic standard is 25 frames per second, and in the US I think it's 23.976 or something, so pretty much 24. Now that should, if you want to shoot cinematically, your frame rate should stay at that setting unless you want to do some slow motion. So let's just talk about the Australian cinematic standard frame rate, which is 25 frames per second. If I want to slow something down, I might shoot it in 50 frames per second or more. If I shoot it in 50 frames per second, then effectively I can slow the video down to half the speed, because 50 is double 25. So I can slow that down to half the speed. But if I'm not going to be using it for slow motion, then I'll just shoot in 25 frames per second. Now the next rule is your shutter speed. Usually your shutter speed for cinematic video should be double your frame rate. So here in Australia, as I said, the cinematic frame rate is 25 frames per second. So my shutter speed should be 1/50, or as close as I can get it. So in the US, if you're shooting 24 frames per second, your shutter speed will be 1/48. So it's just double. And yeah, that's just an important rule, and the reason being is the faster you shutter speed, things start to look really sharp, and they start to look almost fake. You don't get that motion blur when you wave your hand. Right now this is shooting at 25 frames per second with a shutter speed of, I think it should be 50, I haven't even checked. It's just a tutorial though. So yeah, if you move something really quickly, you get that motion blur, which looks nice when you're watching it on a video or TV or a movie or whatever. If your shutter speed's too fast, things that are meant to be blurry are usually really sharp. So to the human eye, that looks very weird and very fake, because we see things with motion blur, and we've been watching movies with motion blur for many years. So we've just gotten used to seeing that motion. Whenever something's too sharp, you notice that when you watch GoPro footage and things like that, where they've shot it with a really high frame rate, with a really fast shutter speed, you can see there's a lot of, it's really sharp and the movements look very fake. And you don't want to go too slow on your shutter speed, because then it starts to look too blurry. So your shutter speed should be double your frame rate. So that's the #1 rule there. Now with that, you're going to have a point where if you're outside, then that shutter speed might be letting in too much light, but then you've also got other settings. So let's go through the ISO, which is ISO. Your ISO should be the lowest you can get it at all times. So the only time your ISO should be bumped up is if all the other settings that we're going to talk about, if all the other settings are set the way they should be and you're still not getting enough light in, that's the only time you should bump your ISO up. To me, it is the last resort to bring more light into the camera, because as you probably all know, the more you bump your ISO up, is the grainier and the worse quality your footage will become. So the Lumix, the lowest native ISO is 200, so I try and shoot on ISO 200 all the time, unless I'm somewhere where the lighting's not the best and I have to bump it up. Unfortunately, the GH4 starts to get very noisy after about ISO 400, 600 or so. It starts to get very noisy, so it's very important to keep that down as low as you can. So we've spoken about the frame rate, we've spoken about shutter speed. Let's now talk about we've spoken about the ISO very quickly, but let's now talk about the aperture. So your aperture is your f-stop. Now, the more open that it is, so the smaller the number. So this is the confusing thing about f-stop. You have, like, say f22, that's actually a very small hole, and you might have f4, f2, that's actually a really big hole. So it doesn't make sense because it's backwards, but once you remember that, it's quite easy to keep remembering. So the wider your aperture, so let's just say you're shooting at f2, which is very wide open. So you're letting in heaps of light with a small aperture, which is a good thing, but what happens is it makes it a lot harder to focus on things because it's letting in so much light that you're getting that depth of field. So if you were to focus on someone, the background's probably blurry. If the background's quite far away, it'll be pretty blurred out. And this is an awesome effect. It looks really, really good. But sometimes when you're using a low aperture, when you're using a big aperture, so a small f-stop number, it's too bright. So what you'll need in that case is an ND filter, which just looks like this, just like a round disc like that. It goes on the front of your lens. They come in different sizes, and you can get them in different shades, I guess, different darknesses, but this one here is variable. So if you see, I've done a video on this, I'm not sure if you can see that, but if I turn that, let me see, you can see it getting darker there, and then brighter again. So this is variable, so I can keep turning that until I get the correct exposure. Summing that up, if you use a small aperture, small aperture number, small f-stop number, say f4 or something, and you use, so it's pretty much a big hole, you're gonna suck in heaps of light, maybe too much, especially if you're outside. So that's when you need an ND filter. And by shooting in a small f-stop number, you'll get nice depth of field. So say me, I'll be in focus, the background will be blurry. But yeah, this makes it very hard to focus because it's the range of when something is in focus is very, very small. So something can be in focus and one tiny little turn and they're out of focus. If they move or you move, they can drop out of focus very quickly. So if you're using like a glide cam, steady cam, a Ronin, anything like that, it's very hard to keep focus on one of those if you're shooting with a wide open aperture. So in that case, you need a follow focus or some kind of focus puller or ring so that you can keep it in focus. Now what I try to do when I'm using the glide cam and the Ronin sometimes is I try and run a small aperture, so a big number. So let's just say we're running like f12, f16, then more things are in focus in your frame. So it's a lot easier to focus. Say for instance, right now I could be in focus, the back of the chair could be in focus, and the window could be in focus. But if I was shooting with a small f-stop, so a wide aperture, I might be in focus, but the background could be all blurred out. So that's why it's so much harder to focus, because the focal plane it's almost like the focal plane is so much further apart with a wide aperture. So even I might be in focus, the chair might not be. Like that's how detrimental it can be. So yeah, if you're shooting small aperture, like a closed up aperture, then more things are in focus. But the only issue with this is that everything gets darker, obviously, because you're not letting in as much light. So it's really just a matter of balancing all those things out. You know, if you want everything in focus, then you're gonna have to close down your aperture. But if you close down your aperture, it's gonna start to get dark. So then that's the point where you might have to start bumping your ISO up. And you don't really ever want to touch your shutter speed unless it's to do slow motion. If you have to, it's not the worst thing in the world if you have to bump your shutter speed up a little bit or down a little bit, but I prefer not to. I always try and just get the desired result with my ISO and my aperture. So yeah, that's what makes this thing really hard. If you're shooting, you know, outside, it's really, really bright, but you want some depth of field, you need an ND filter. Let's just say you're shooting inside and you want lots of things to be in focus, so it's easier for you to pull focus. Then you want to close down your aperture, but then it gets darker, so you need lighting. It's just one of those things where you just got to find the best way around it. And like I said before, just keep your ISO as low as possible at all times. There's going to get to a point where you're going to have to raise it. Like if you're inside, you want your you want your aperture closed down a bit so that more things are in focus. And yeah, in that case, you're going to have to start bumping your ISO up. So one thing I just forgot to add, which I quickly will, this is one of my favorite lenses. It's a Sigma 1835 with a constant aperture of 1.8. So for those who don't know, 1.8 is a very wide open aperture. It lets in heaps of light. So if I'm using this outside and I've got all my settings the way I want them, low ISO, you know, shutter speed, double my frame rate, and the aperture, if I use 1.8, it is very, very, very bright. So I definitely need an ND filter when I'm using this outside at the lowest aperture. But at the same time, the focus on this, the depth of field, it's just, you know, this part of my face can be in focus and the edges can be blurry. That's how low the aperture is on this camera. So this lens, sorry. So sometimes what I do with this is I have to bump the aperture up because it's just not sharp enough. It doesn't get as many things in focus that I like sometimes. So yeah, that's the Sigma 1835. In my opinion, it's one of the best lenses for the GH4. But to use this, you'll need a speed booster. And On the GH4, I've done videos on this before, on the GH4 if you get a speed booster, it actually allows you to suck in more light as well, which is never a bad thing. I think that's about it. I've explained most of it very quickly. I hope it all made sense. If it didn't, and you have any questions at all, let me know in the comments below. I hope this helped someone out there. If it did, please subscribe if you haven't already. Please give this video a big thumbs up, and that's about all. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.